Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man working as a climatologist gets a report of a place with weird weather. So, what's the forecast there? Because here, it is snowing feathers.
As a climatologist, I spend most of my days just screaming into the void. One academic paper at a time, I start to feel more and more like a doomsday prophet. The end is nigh, we yell from the proverbial rooftops. But honestly, I'm as sick of doing that as you are listening to it. Don't get me wrong, I love my job. I get to see and understand things that others usually take for granted. To see the machinations of the planet come together to explain an unpredictable outcome. To face the storm and say, yeah, I get it. We're learning the language of Mother Nature, her screams, tantrums, agony, and relief. But earlier this year, I was sent to study something new and different. I wouldn't go as far as to say we're bound to the whims of an eccentric millionaire, but at the same time, it wouldn't be too far from the truth. Most of our collective projects are privately funded. Most of the time, we're free to do whatever we please, as long as we make our parent company look good. But sometimes they point us in a direction and ask us to go fetch. We're basically academics on retainer, ready to drop our projects at a moment's notice to service our masters. Yeah, I don't like that metaphor either. One day an article dropped in my inbox. It was sensationalist nonsense. No more than 400 words about fishermen coming back from the sea covered in feathers. They called it feather snow, and they swore to its authenticity, claiming it usually came around every 2 weeks or so. The article played it off as a joke, but I wasn't laughing. I could see who sent it to us, our parent company. We had a short staff meeting, and it turned out everyone had been sent the same article. Someone was heading southeast of Portsmouth to debunk it. Well, it turns out that someone was me. I got set up at a small bed and breakfast. All cynicism aside, the people of New Hampshire are wonderful. They were welcoming and understanding, and without a hint of mean spirit. I felt so open about what I was doing there that I told anyone who asked, and I got very honest responses. Apparently, the feathers now was a known phenomenon that dated back to the 80s. It was more frequent nowadays, but there were articles way back speaking of the same thing. Fishermen who'd gotten caught in it weren't locals, and had called the papers. That resulted in the article we'd seen. The locals knew better. This type of thing happened every now and then. Once I got to talking with the local fishermen, it was made apparent that feather snow was a real thing. Very real. They planned around it, and they avoided it when they could. They'd pull up their nets early and reposition their boats to avoid it. 4 different families of fishermen showed me feathers from the previous falls that they'd saved in jars, and I was allowed to take some home for testing. It dawned on me that these were real people dealing with real consequences. This wasn't some sensationalist nonsense. I sent the feathers in for testing with some of my colleagues. The results were back within a couple of days. 4 different types of gulls, great black-backed, laughing Mew and Franklins, as well as a couple of Forster's tern. Pretty common New Hampshire seaside birds. These weren't some fake duck feathers saved up in a jar just for fun. These were actual, real feathers. Why would they just come falling out of the sky and so frequently? I managed to get a hold of a captain, willing to take me out to sea at the next feather snow. Captain Willard Morrow and his son Robert. They also had 2 fishermen who worked for them, but there was no need to bring them along just to witness the feather snow. Instead, the 3 of us were going alone. I brought all kinds of equipment. I was going to measure everything from cloud density to humidity to freaking radon. I just brought whatever I could. Before I left my room, I also brought along my lucky binoculars. Few things can be as valuable as seeing something up close with your own eyes. And these binoculars had been with me for a long time. Hell, they'd helped me spot the origin point of a tornado once. It was a Sunday afternoon when we pulled up the anchor and set out to sea. Not too far out, but far enough that the coastline started to look like a thread. I double-checked my equipment, and Willard was doing the same. His boat was tried and tested, but all electronics were no more than a couple of years old. Just as I was making sure I'd capture everything, he was making sure we were getting back to land. His son, Robert, spent most of his time texting and counting the minutes. Feathers now wasn't something new and exciting to these people. Around 6 p.m., we saw the first signs. Clouds were gathering, but they were spread thin and white. When it rains, clouds turn black. These were classic cirrus clouds, not something you associate with bad weather or storms. Strong winds, perhaps. I was triple-checking my equipment when Robert poked his head out of the cabin window. He pointed just off the side of the boat. See? There's one. He was right. There was a feather there. How hadn't I noticed it? Then I saw it. Millions of feathers falling in unison, a blanket spread out for miles, tumbling through the air just a couple of feet of distance between them. White feathers calmly touching the ocean. A few of them landed on me, and the boat got covered in them. Robert sighed. He was probably going to have to hose the deck off once we got back to land. There it is, said Willard. Like clockwork. Feathers now. What do you think? No idea, I said, shaking my head. How can it... Every 2 weeks? Yous believe us now? We're not just telling stories anymore? Catching a feather between my fingers, I just stared in disbelief. Of course, I'd thought they were lying. I'd thought it for days, but this was real. This was something you could hold in your hand. Willard just laughed. When I got back to my room, I started trying to make sense of the data. There'd been no increase in humidity. It was as if 1 second there was nothing, then there were feathers. Usually I could tell by the equipment readings when something happened, but there was no cutoff point. There was not a single point where I could say, look, this is where the feathers started to fall. There was nothing like that. They tumbled down, and that was it. Full stop. I talked to my boss about it, explaining that we basically had nothing to go on. He didn't care for it. Either I made something out of this or I didn't. I could debunk it or explain it. There was no middle ground. Now that I'd seen it and taken pictures, there was no question of it anymore. It was authentic, but odd. That was the best way to describe it. Odd. I spent a couple of days just making up a new plan. I spent my nights at the local pub watching football. Go Wildcats, I guess. And taking long walks. I didn't know how to proceed. There are no rule books for this type of thing. I met Willard and his two fishermen at the pub one night. They recommended I talk to a guy named Humphrey, or Hump, and they gave me a number. He was a pilot of a small plane used for displaying banners and messages, a skywriter of sorts. He was a retiree who ran a private pilot course for folks around the area, and he was a bit of a local celebrity. You should see what's going on in the clouds, Willard suggested, and if you're going up, you want Hump to pilot the damn thing. It wasn't a bad idea, and it earned them a couple of beers. Go Wildcats. I'm not afraid of heights, and I'm not afraid of flying, but this time, I was. I got in touch with Hump, and we decided to go up during the next feather snow. He didn't mind. The winds were usually mild, and he had a proposal to help out with anyway. As long as I promised to help him with the lettering, he would help me out, free of charge. How could I say no? He brought me out to this tiny airstrip on the outskirts of town. There was barely any asphalt on the road there, but the strip itself was immaculate. It was privately owned, and Hump took great care of it. As I got there, he was hosing off the plane. We shook hands, had a few laughs, and I helped him with the letters. "Marry me, Jocelyn," it said in bold red letters. When it was time to go, I had to cram myself into the back seat of the plane. There were only 2 seats, and I couldn't bring much equipment. I settled for my camera and my binoculars. Hump, being of a slightly larger than average frame, barely fit in the front seat. Still, he was as used to flying as I was to walking. I know I shouldn't have felt safe in that tiny seat, but there wasn't a hint of insecurity in anything he said. If anything, it was going to be fun. Good old Hump. Cirrus clouds usually rest at about 5,000 to 6,000 meters, and we were going well beyond 8,000. There would be plenty of opportunity for me to see what was going on for myself. Hump even agreed to stay lower than usual. He was, truth be told, a little questioning about why we were going out. Not because he was afraid, but because he didn't get the point. There was nothing out there. Sure, feather snow was weird, but it wasn't malicious. There wasn't a single shipwreck out there because of it. It was too close to shore. But we took to the skies. Man, feeling that big piece of metal lift from the earth is something I'll never get used to. It is one thing to be on a commercial flight, but this thing was tiny. Every twist and turn registered instantly in my stomach. When Hump started joking about a barrel roll, I nearly gagged. It wasn't the kind of thing you get used to. You either love it instantly or hate it for the rest of your life. I was clearly in the latter category. We circled around town a couple of times, 4 in total. Hump got a text message confirming they'd seen the proposal, and he turned the plane around. I just wanted it to be over. I got a hand cramp from steadying myself, and my ears were ringing from the sound of the propeller. Still, I'm a professional. I wanted to take some pictures and see what was going on. Once we started seeing the cirrus clouds, I got my camera out. It helped to watch the world through a lens. It made it seem less real. I took a few pictures, but wasn't seeing anything in particular. I leaned back to regain my composure when Hump spoke up. "Hey, you seen this?" he asked. "That's a lot of birds." I looked back down as Hump circled the area. He was right, it was a whole lot of birds. Hundreds, maybe thousands. More than there should be. They were circling a particularly thick part of the cloud cover. Hump took us down to get a better view, and I photographed at least a dozen different species, all flying in a circular formation like a ring in the sky. It would have been impossible to see them from the ground. They were hidden by the clouds. They were all of different white plumages, and they kept to a certain part of the sky where the clouds obscured them. "You seeing this?" he repeated. "What are they doing?" "Same as us," I laughed. "Either sightseeing or fishing." I brought out my binoculars to get a better look. Then I saw it. In the center of the bird ring, where the clouds were the thickest, there was a black spot. It hadn't been there a few seconds ago. A big circle-like shape. I photographed it, putting my camera on max zoom. What happened next will haunt me. A white circle appeared inside the black spot. As Hump took us up, I realized I was staring at an eye. An eye the length of 2 fishing boats. In the literal blink of an eye, thousands of birds just disappeared. Their bodies were gone, leaving only feathers behind. Feathers that slowly wafted down like snow. Then, the eye turned its attention to us. I could see a faint outline in the clouds, like a shimmering celestial flatfish, too large to comprehend. I started hyperventilating, burying my head between my knees, staring into myself instead of out the window. I pounded the back of Hump's seat, stammering to take us away. Nothing happened. I forced myself to look up, only to see the front seat empty. Nothing but the clothes remained of Hump as the plane started to turn, fast. What happened next were the most panicked seconds of my life. Trying to wrap my head around what I'd seen, trying to pull the flight stick up, trying to get loose and climb into the front seat, all while plummeting towards the open ocean. I sat on Hump's warm clothes as the ocean came rushing towards me. I don't know how I survived. The crash was devastating. I remember crawling out of a wreckage, being cut by hot metal, leaning against a life preserver. There was an intense cold, followed by a pleasant warmth. I threw up at least 3 times, and I passed out just as something shone a light in my face. I woke up 2 days later in a hospital. The crash was pretty big local news, but that's all it was. No mentions of eyes in the sky, no mentions of the feather snow. No, apparently Hump was a known alcoholic who did sightseeing flights without a license. My name was spared from the articles, but there were plenty of mentions of an implied rich snob who got his comeuppance. I haven't been back since, and my physical therapy is progressing slower than it should. It feels like that thing is still out there, looking for me. It has seen me, and now it wants to know where I went. It wants to do something with me. The entire me, not just my body. It wants to take me away, leaving nothing but a shell behind. My feathers, if you will. There have been no more reports of feathers now outside the coast southeast of Portsmouth. Apparently it stopped after Hump disappeared. But just last night, as I was struggling to sleep, I saw it. Clear as day, a single white feather dancing towards the ground. I think it's here.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man experiences a horrific accident that leaves him blind. But the need for independence causes him to seek a special kind of job. So, where's your job located? Because I work in the all-blind laboratory.
I got my PhD from the Stockholm Royal Institute of Technology and finished my postdoctoral work at the University of Bern in Switzerland in 2015. I won't go into detail, but my work centered around electromagnetic disruption and practical electromedical application. Chances are that if you check Google Scholar for these keywords, my name will pop up as a co-author on at least one of the top 5 results. However, in early December of 2016, I was in an accident. I was staying overnight for a conference in Copenhagen, where a colleague of mine had rented a large apartment. However, due to an electrical error, there was heat buildup in the main water heater, causing a steam explosion. I was sleeping pretty much wall to wall with it. My face and shoulders took the main brunt of the boiling water, steam, and pressure. The last thing I remember seeing was a bright light, followed by a sudden and complete dark. I had to go through evisceration and enucleation of both eyes. I lost 8 teeth on the right side of my face and most of my nose. At least 20% of the body fat in my right arm was burned off. The reconstructive surgery of my face took a team of surgeons 18 hours. This was followed by months of just trying to survive, moving back in with my family and going through cosmetic surgery, mainly for my face. To this day, I still have no idea what was said at the conference. After a few months, I was fitted for double eye prosthetics. It took a total of 3 months before I was even given the option to start therapy. I'm not gonna lie, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Most people who are legally blind can still perceive some kind of light, but complete blindness, about 7% of us, is one step further. One day I could be suicidal, and the next day I was determined to learn Braille. Because of the damage to my eyelids, the surgeons opted to connect new tear ducts to my nose, a dacryocysterinostomy, so crying just made my nose run. 3 years later, I was in a much better state of mind. Although sudden blindness isn't something you ever really adapt to, I was doing better. I still wasn't ready to go out on my own, but with a friend or family member just to help me along, I could go pretty far. I also learned to appreciate all those weird accessibility options that come with most computers. You have no idea. In autumn of 2019, I was contacted by a man who told me he represented a group associated with renewable energy research. Living in Sweden, renewable energy is a big deal, and it is something I've personally been interested in. In fact, it was going to be the subject of my next article, just before the accident. The man offered me a job. He told me that he worked at a lab with disabled scientists, and that my expertise was in high demand. The pay was more than generous, and as a benefit package, I would be given a personal assistant. Pay for an off-site 2-bedroom apartment was also a part of the benefits. I agreed to have an interview. The man who was going to interview me was clearly from another country, but he was ready to fly out to meet me at short notice. He came to visit the very next day. We had a private conversation at my parents' house. He asked a lot of questions about my work, and I could hear him tapping away at a touchscreen. We discussed some of the details, but there was one thing he consciously seemed to avoid: where the main lab was located. He seemed uncomfortable talking about it, but he promised that I would be given a private flight wherever I wanted during downtime, off-site. There would be 4 weeks of work on site, living in the apartment outside the main lab, followed by 2 weeks off-site, kind of like paid vacation. I would be in rotating shifts with one morning, midday, evening, and night shift. The weirdest thing was revealed just as I was about to accept the offer. Every single scientist at the main lab was completely blind. I accepted the offer. The next week I was picked up by the same man, let's call him Samuel, and taken to a private flight. I still had no idea where we were going, but other passengers were speaking in an Asian language. Indonesian, I think. On the flight, I was introduced to my personal assistant, Mila. I think she was Australian. Mila was a darling. She knew exactly what to say and when to help me. But most importantly, she knew when to give me space. It was as if she could read discomfort on my, albeit reconstructed face, and just acted on it immediately. She must have had a lot of experience working with the visually impaired. My first few days were mostly orientation introductions. I would be working with a team of 2 other scientists and 7 assistants, 2 each, 1 general. Apparently, our personal assistants would not be available while in the lab, but they would be on call as soon as we went off-site. They would also help us with cooking, cleaning, whatever we wanted. It was a big operation, a total of 40 people just in the main building, all completely blind. At least 100 others. With the pay we were getting and the benefits, this was a very expensive project. We're talking millions, possible tens of millions. My team would be working with material research. As Samuel explained, they were developing a new type of material as part of renewable energy tech. They weren't completely clear on the possible end result, but the metal we would be testing was told to be unique, extremely valuable, and uncomfortably bright. Apparently, it could cause blindness during prolonged exposure, which was the main reason they'd put together a team of blind scientists. During my first day at the facility, I was given plenty of time to adapt. The other members of my team were just as new as I was, but we were given radio instructions how to move through the various corridors. There was a decontamination room without protective suits, and we were told to follow guiding pipes along the walls. On the left were cold pipes, on the right were warm. 3 pipes on each side, leading to a total of 6 rooms. The pipes had square, circle, and triangle engravings, making it easier for us to find our main room. We were Team Warm Triangle. The work itself wasn't that bad, mostly just repetitive. The test object was isolated in a separate room, but we could check it through samples, material exposures, and readings. We were all given separate workstations and hearing equipment, so we could isolate the sounds of our specific assistants. And just to make sure our computer equipment wouldn't read over one another. We had buttons on our headsets to adjust who could listen in and to mute certain sounds. It took a lot of time to adapt to it. There were at least 50 codes to memorize. I got to know my assistants fairly well. There was Aaron, an American, and Holger, a Norwegian. They were both older than me and both had master's degrees. They were quick to follow directions and equally quick to offer suggestions. I could tell they were having some authority issues, but they didn't make it a problem, and the first 3 week-long shifts were fine. We went from midday to evening to night. The night shift was, of course, the toughest. By now, I was getting to know the place and routine. I had noticed a few things during my testing, but also just from the context of what was being talked about in the facility. The 7th assistant would come down with lunches for us, and we ate in a small common room, warm circle, where we would talk more freely about what we'd learned. We never changed from Warm Triangle as our main room, even when we changed shifts. The whole setup was weird. The material was extremely reflective. From the way it was tested, it seemed rectangular in shape and thin. My colleagues talked about it possibly being similar to a pane of glass. The material had several strange properties. It would absorb light, but dissipated it almost instantly. It would, to some degree, also absorb electric energy, low-level radiation, and radio waves. I'd never seen anything like it, if you pardon the expression. By chance, we also discovered a peculiar feature. The object, by now called the pane, briefly absorbed sound waves and would reflect it back after a few seconds. Like a delayed echo, but slightly distorted. Kind of like it had been run through an underwater filter, bouncing between sheets of metal. If I said hello, I would hear a clear but lower hello right back after about 8 seconds. This being despite me standing no less than 10 feet away from the object. It made no sense. Once during the night shift, Holger fell ill. It wasn't bad, just a light case of pneumonia, but the company had a zero-tolerance policy for sickness in the workplace. He got the week off at his apartment, and I had to work with 1 less assistant. It delayed my progress somewhat, but Aaron was eager to make up for lost time. Too eager, it turns out. On the second to last day of the night shift, Aaron accidentally caused a power outage. We were pressure testing the object when Aaron slipped and knocked over some volatile materials at another workstation. Nothing happened, explosion-wise, but the entire room went into immediate lockdown and the power was shut off. The door shut and locked from the outside. I didn't notice the lights go out, but I could feel the room quickly growing cold. It occurred to me that the object was probably absorbing the warmth, and there was no climate control to compensate it for. Then something weird happened. We were all sitting quietly, our headsets being turned off, and waited for the power to come back on. That's when I heard something.
Hello.
It was the same off-putting, distorted voice that I had thought was a delayed echo. One of my colleagues, Gertrude, responded with a hello right back. I heard 4 quick footsteps like the start of a drum roll and something slamming into the glass, separating us from the object. Something squishy.
Hello.
Now we stayed quiet. The footsteps came in quick bursts, pacing back and forth, looking for weaknesses in the glass. We usually use small airlocks to put in samples to test. We had 2 airlocks, and the leftmost one of these was attacked. I could hear something rattling in the airlock, trying to rip it loose.
Hello.
I could hear the grinding sound of metal being bent. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath. Power came back with a vengeance. My headphones were full of people screaming. Evacuation protocol initiated. Proceed to... Get out! Get the fuck out! Warm triangle, respond immediately, I repeat dash. Half the voices were in a foreign language. We ran for the door. I didn't need to follow the pipes to get back to the decontamination room. But only then did I notice we were 1 person short. We'd lost Gertrude. Once outside, we were separated and isolated. Standing outside in freezing temperatures, I was stripped naked. Several people, all screaming in a foreign language, lifted my arms and legs and checked me from my feet all the way to my hair. I was forced into a plastic tent where they shaved my head, forced my mouth open, and checked my teeth. My ears were cleaned with some sort of antiseptic, and my eye prosthetics were discarded completely. It was quick, violent, and terrifying. I was locked inside my apartment the rest of the night. Mila came around to help me, but she told me she was instructed not to talk about my work under any circumstances. That's when I first suspected that my apartment was bugged. I spent a week in that apartment with daily checkups. I felt fine, but the entire ordeal was stressing me out. Having my head shaved was uncomfortable, and I was scared they might find something they wouldn't like. After that 1 week, I was suddenly told that it was necessary to terminate my position. I didn't recognize the voice of the man telling me this. I was given 4 months of full pay, an apology, a non-disclosure agreement, and an immediate flight back home. Mila was holding back tears, trying to help me pack. She seemed frightened. I've been home ever since, but I come to you to share my story. I've been doing my best to stay financially independent, but life hasn't been treating me well. I'm still having stress reactions, and there has been a recent development that I don't know how to deal with. Last night, as I was brushing my teeth, the power went out. I could hear the air conditioning and the dryer suddenly go quiet, and the entire room felt colder, except for the bathroom mirror, which radiated a slight heat. I stretched my hand out to touch it. This might be hard to understand for someone who doesn't think about their sense of touch too often, but I've touched that mirror every night for years on end by now. I know exactly where my hand was in the space of the room, and there was no mirror where my hand was. Still, I touched it. Every part of my finger touched something extruding from the mirror's surface, something with rounded edges. Then it made a sound.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man looking to relocate for his job finds himself in a scary situation after a bus ride accident. So, what would you do to survive? Because Noah ate someone.
A few years ago, I was moving from Cleveland to Minneapolis. It had been the worst year of my life. The man I'd been dating for the past 3 years had been involved in a scam and squandered most of our joint savings along the way. Shortly after, I lost my job. I just couldn't keep up with the pressure of finding a new place and surviving on breadcrumbs, and I just broke down. So I decided to start over in Minneapolis. I had a couple of friends who offered me a couch to crash on for a couple of weeks. I was looking to get a new job and start over fresh. I got on a Greyhound with nothing but 2 suitcases and a handful of unread DMS. It was a long trip. Most people stepped off in Chicago and Milwaukee. So for the final stretch of the trip, there was only 2 people left. Me and a passenger sitting right across from me. A man in his early 60s. He had a kind face and spent most of his time sending messages to his friends and family. I got the impression that this was some kind of event for him. He had a fanny pack with snacks, an extra battery for his phone, sunscreen on the tip of his ears, and a pair of Ray-Bans resting on his trucker cap. I talked to him a little. His name was Noah. He was heading home after a long consultation job out of state. He was some kind of environmental lawyer. He was all about public transportation and reducing the carbon footprint. I could tell he was a jubilant fellow. I don't know a lot of people who speak so highly of their job. About half an hour from our destination, the bus suddenly lurched. There was someone standing in the middle of the road, and the driver had done his best to steer out of the way. I saw a brief silhouette of someone small go by the window, possibly a child. Moments later, we were thrown into a ditch, and the bus tipped over. In the blink of an eye, all turned to chaos. I was thrown out of my seat like a slack-necked doll, and there was this awful metal groaning noise. The side of the bus was torn open. Suddenly, the world was still. My mind was spinning. I barely made it off the bus before I hurled, my inner ear screaming at me to lie down. Everything felt different. The air tasted metal. We'd driven straight into a field, leaving a long trail of bent grass and wild blue sunflowers behind us. As the engines of the bus died, all that was left was the flapping of moth wings. Looking back at the road, there was no one there. I couldn't see Noah or the bus driver. I picked up my phone and called the police without a second thought. I felt disoriented, and the strangest details stood out to me. Like, how often do you stop to look at the shape of your phone, or stop to think about the actual code you use to unlock it? While still on the phone, I was asked by the operator to check if everyone was okay. I moved to the front of saw the driver's seat empty, and rounded the corner. "Can you see them?" the operator asked again. "Is everyone all right?" I heard the noise before I saw them. This thick, meaty squish, the tearing, clicking teeth. The kindly-looking Noah was sitting a bit further out in the field, with a streak of blood trailing it. He was cradling the driver in his arms, slowly biting off pieces from the side of his head. Hair and all slurped up like spaghetti. It looked almost serene, like a grazing antelope. "Excuse me, miss," the operator repeated. "Can you see them?" "Yes," I whispered breathlessly. "Yes, I do." "Is everyone all right?" Noah looked up at me with complete disinterest. For a moment, his eyes met mine, and he was as calm as ever. There was no panic, no regret, nothing. Like a dog enjoying a meaty bone. "No," I wheezed back into the phone. "No, we're not all right." Yes, he'd killed and eaten that man. The moment we got off the bus, the first thing he'd done was to kill and eat him. No hesitation whatsoever. For a good 15 minutes, I just stood there, watching. The police were on their way, but this was a bit out of their way. Noah didn't seem to mind an audience. He just bit, chew, and swallowed. Bit, chew, and swallow. Thin spurts of blood stained his horn-rimmed glasses. But I couldn't move or look away. I couldn't bring myself to move or turn my back on him. I was just frozen. The moment the police arrived, they didn't even pull out their guns. They just stood there, staring in disbelief. Putting Noah in handcuffs and taking him away was completely uneventful. There was no struggle, no sudden attacks, nothing. Noah just looked disappointed to have his meal taken away, like a child tiredly reaching for his teddy bear. I was so distraught after stating my witness account that I forgot one of my bags. I just took the one closest to me and got out of there. I couldn't bring myself to call on my friends. I crashed at the first motel I came across. I sat up all night staring into the ceiling, still trying to make some kind of sense about what I'd seen. I didn't notice myself crying, and I didn't notice how those cries slowly turned to screams. I just lay there, head empty, screaming into a cheap, tear-stained motel pillow. Over the following weeks, I settled into a new place, a new job, and a new life. Everything was different, but in ways I hadn't anticipated. I felt like an alien, as if the world had shifted. Like I'd seen something not of this earth. Some of the most mundane things felt strange. Eating a sesame seed bagel at the cafe down on the corner felt like ashes in my mouth. All I could think about was teeth, tearing, ripping, curious eyes looking my way. But looking past all that, there was something else that kept crawling back into my mind. just how awful I was at judging someone's character. How I hadn't noticed the scam my ex had been wrapped up in, costing us our savings. How I hadn't noticed how I was neglecting my work to the point where they had to let me go, and now this. How I couldn't see that the friendly Noah on the bus had been ready to eat a living person at the drop of a hat. It didn't add up to me. How do you miss something like that? I was one of the witnesses called in the trial that followed. I hoped it'd be a chance to finally put it all behind me. I said my piece, and I stayed to watch the proceedings. I had to know more about this man and what turned him into this monster. He didn't look like a monster, though. He was just a man in a suit. He even had the same glasses. I couldn't look past his friendly demeanor, still as unbothered by this whole situation as the day I saw him bite down on raw flesh. There was a clinical psychologist called to the stand. He'd been there to assess Noah's mental state and was ready to share his findings. Mr. Ayton is deeply confused, he said. To him, this behavior is not something new. This is something he's been forced to do for years in order to survive. Is he confessing further crimes? Yes, the psychologist continued. But Mr. Ayton has lost perception of reality. He speaks of living in a forest, hunting people for food. He has no memory of ever having a family or an occupation. To him, his life has been about inhuman acts brought by never-ending strife. And you assess that this belief is a genuine response to trauma? Yes, his belief is genuine, the psychologist agreed. This man has suffered a great trauma. There was a short pause as the psychologist checked his notes and adjusted his glasses. It's as if he believes he comes from a different world. In Noah's mind, he'd been a murderer for years, trapped in a sort of limbo state. His description of the world was horrifying, living in a space of ruptured reality where the only certainty was famine and pain. He'd taken refuge in what he believed to be the shell of an abandoned bus. Suddenly, there were intruders in his space, one of which he killed and ate. The other he didn't mind, since he was already having his fill. According to his testimony, he was even willing to share. He wanted to be a good host. His family spoke of another story. To them, Noah was a kind man with a busy schedule. There were pictures of him coaching his son's basketball team. He'd recently celebrated 30 years of marriage to his wife, which he loved dearly. To them, this was an unreal nightmare. There was nothing in his history pointing to this kind of madness. Something happened, they said. Something must have happened on that bus. I hate to admit it, but I agreed. It just didn't make sense. I'm not sure what happened to Noah. There was a lot of talk behind closed doors, and most of what was said stayed there. The papers didn't say a lot about it. There was mention of a case of mutilation, but every report about it was vague. It's as if no one really wanted to report it. Maybe they didn't know if it was a case of mental illness or something more sinister. Either way, there wasn't much said about him. I tried to put it out of my head. I caught up with my unread DMS. I'd been dreading reading worried texts, demands about unpaid bills, and whatever else might kick me further while I was down. I couldn't go back to that world just yet, but I sort of had to. But that's where things took another turn. I didn't recognize these messages. Unknown names and numbers, asking me to call them back. One begged me to reconsider. Another sent me an address and a name. All kinds of strange, even coded messages. Also, bank accounts, payments. That made me pause. I had no idea who these people were or what they wanted from me. Had they gotten the wrong number? I remember my second bag. I'd only brought the one, which I'd stashed away in my bathroom. I hadn't opened it since that night. And the second bag, well, I still hadn't talked to the police about it. But I decided that before I did anything else, I ought to at least unpack what little I'd brought, even though it might be stained with blood or worse. I couldn't bear the thought of it. But opening the bag, well, there was nothing of the sort in it. It was my bag. I was certain of it. But there were no clothes or keepsakes. Instead, it had syringes wrapped in leather casings, little clear vials, unmarked, sheets of plastic, bags, duct tape, and knives. Several knives of various sizes, all sharpened to perfection. I picked one up, it fit perfectly into my hand as if made for me. Looking up at the bathroom mirror, There was something about the image looking back at me that I couldn't recognize. While I could feel a frown forming on my brow, the face looking at me had a creeping smirk, and I saw it blink. That was only the beginning. The police didn't have my second bag. There had never been a second bag. There was only that one bag, and I couldn't recognize a thing in it. Even stranger, I couldn't get in touch with anyone I knew. All numbers seemed to be out of commission. My parents, my sister, my friends, none of them. I couldn't call them or find their social media profiles. In my bag there was a wallet, several fake IDs, and thousands of dollars in cash. I couldn't recognize the president on the bill. With every revelation, the smirk on my mirror image deepened. It would tilt its head the other way. It would look up and down, observing me. I'd raise my hand towards it, and it wouldn't return the gesture. Once, when I was in the bathroom, the bulb went out. I was standing there, fresh out of the shower, in complete darkness. I wrapped my cold towel around me, and I heard something. It sounded like a distant echo of my own voice, as if spoken from the other side of a window. Closer, it whispered. I didn't say anything. I just held my breath and listened. I'm lost, it continued. Coming home. A finger brushed against my hair. I recoiled, and so did something else. I heard footsteps, moving away. As I opened the bathroom door and let some light in, the mirror image was nothing out of the ordinary. But somewhere out there in the dark, I heard waning footsteps. With every message I received, it was becoming increasingly clear that people were expecting something of me. That I'd move somewhere, meet someone, do something. I was asked about my equipment, about places and times. There were also a handful of threats from people expressing disappointment. There was a knock on the door once. Another time, I saw a car slowing down to watch me through the kitchen window. There were mysterious phone calls at night, and whenever I stepped into a dark room, I'd stay clear of mirrors. If I stepped too close, I could hear something moving in there. Footsteps, irregular breaths. Sometimes I'd feel the warmth of something reaching for me. Skin, just inches away. Then, a hasty retreat. I decided to retrace my steps. After all, Noah Ayton had been a family man before we swerved off that road. But what the hell had I been? Maybe he wasn't the only one who'd changed. I rented a car and took to the highway. I was having trouble navigating, ending up down a couple of roads I wasn't supposed to. When I finally began to recognize where I was meant to go, the sun was already setting. I didn't care. I was ready to drive through the night if need be. The first rain spatter came as soon as the sun set. The wind was picking up. I didn't dare to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to think about what I might see. I don't know how long I drove. After a while, I stopped seeing other cars on the road. Then, a shadow. Someone in the middle of the road. A boy? I stepped on the brakes. A couple of moths thumped against my windshield as my car came to a full stop. I caught a glance at a side view mirror, only to see a hand reaching out. I blinked it away. I got out of the car, looking back down the road. I could still see the silhouette of a boy, walking away, just like that night when the bus swerved off the road. This had to be connected. It just had to. I left my car running by the side of the road. "Wait," I called out. "Hold on." He didn't stop. I was catching up, but as it turns out, I wasn't the only one. As I got closer, other figures emerged from the rain. Some of them looked like me. Others only held a vague resemblance. A select few were identical. Further out, there were other figures. Some impossibly tall, others barely even human. We all looked at one another, our heads turning in unison. Left, right, left. Like a ripple of thought forcing us all to do the same. A collective impulse. "I want my knives back." A voice breaking through the rain. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. I'd seen her in the mirror dozens of times by now. But this time her voice was unhindered. There was no mirror in the way. I could feel her staring at me. We were all spread out in a circle around the mysterious voice. A sort of beacon we'd all gathered around. And the closer we got, the stranger things became. I lost track of time. I could barely feel the weight of my heartbeats as they quickened and slowed, seemingly at random. The wind picked up, then disappeared, then reappeared. Rain to snow to hail to summer sun. In In one blink of an eye, the world was on fire. In another, we were standing in oncoming traffic, cars throwing themselves off the road to avoid us. In one place, the stars were gone and the ground was nothing but black sand. In so many places, there was nothing left. No life, no sky, nothing. It was terrifying. I wanted to turn around to run, but I couldn't trust the figure to my side not to take advantage. Instead, I stopped. A few moved closer, only to dissipate or be changed forever. One sprouted a third arm. Another was dragged into the dark by an unseen force. One fell to the ground, stretched and bent like hot metal. Screams, cries, and hysterical laughter. Slowly, the boy moved away. With every step he took, I could feel my world slowing down. By the time I could feel the rain on my skin again, there was a hand on my shoulder. I was grabbed, spun around, and pushed. In front of me, my twisted mirror image. "Go home," it hissed. "I'm done with this place." A push. Shadows growing distant and the rain growing stronger. A different rain. There was an unknown car waiting by the side of the road. One more neatly parked. Similar to the one I'd used, but not the same. Going through the glove box, I recognized several items. Looking in the back seat, there were 2 familiar bags. I realized what had happened. I'd been gone, and now I'd returned. I have been back here for quite some time now. Here, where Noah Ayton is an ordinary family man without any articles mentioning his name. I settled into my new place and eventually got a new job. Got back in touch with my family and friends. I started to recognize the faces on my dollar bills again. But a few things have happened. No one has seen my ex for a while. There was a string of disappearances around the area where I used to live back in Cleveland. I don't like to think about what has happened there. Am I responsible? If not, who is? I'm not sure what happened that night. Not really. I think we got too close to something we shouldn't. And what little sense we make of this world got mixed up. I can't help but to look a little longer at mirrors. I lean my ear in to listen, making sure I don't hear anything. I turn my head back and forth, making sure the image follows. So far, it does. But I sometimes get the sense that it doesn't. Maybe in the dark, when I can't look as closely. If you find yourself near a strange sunflower field, keep your eyes on the road. Slow down. And if you do get a little too close, watch your surroundings, check your bills, and in more ways.